Unit 3 is on assessing. We're going to determine structural limits to flexibility, determine motor pattern dysfunctions in achieving active range of motion when sufficient passive ranges exist, and determine the best course of action to see mobility improvements in the context of the individual's specific limitations. Now, I'm going to geek out a little bit on some anatomical components here and show why it's important to consider specific anatomic limitations and their anatomic geometry as it relates to a person's mobility. When we look at the structure of the pelvis, you can see there's a lot of different types based on person's genetic structure or their gender or where they're from in the world. You can have very distinct differences in the shape of the pelvis. So we could have a gynoid, an arthropoid, android, or platyploid shaped pelvis, which is going to dictate how wide that pelvic ring is. You could have a very distinct difference in the angle between the sacrum and the pubic symphysis on the front of the pelvis. Some people may be angled backwards, some people may be angled forwards. That changes lengths of muscles and lever lengths acting on the pelvis. You might even have a big difference between the line of the PSIS to the ischial openings on the bottom of the pelvis, which again change the angle of pull on things like your glutes, your piriformis, glute maximus, any of the muscles that would attach to the pelvis or to the femur. The angle of the femoral neck can be very different in a lot of people as well. A normal angle is somewhere around 135 degrees, but that femoral neck could be anywhere from 90 to 180 degrees. And in each of those situations, loading and mobility is going to be drastically different. The femoral neck itself can be in either a retroverted position, an anteverted position, or a neutral position. So if somebody's in more of a retroverted position, they're going to have more of a toe pointing out when they just stand in a normal situation, because that femoral neck inserting into the acetabulum, they're going to be rotated into a new position. Femoral anteversion means they may be in a bit of a toe in or position comparatively. So where they stand, if they stand toe in or toe out, may have nothing to do with hip musculature. It may have everything to do with structure. The acetabulum itself may point forwards, backwards, to the side, below. So the positioning of that acetabulum is again going to affect geometry of the structure and how much mobility they have in different directions. The depth of that acetabulum can vary in a lot of people as well. You could have what's clinically known as a Celtic hip, a very deep hip socket as a number one, or you could have a dysplastic hip for hip dysplasia, a very shallow socket that's almost example of a glenoid fossa in the shoulder. If somebody's in more of a retroverted acetabulum, they're going to put more pressure on the posterior element of the acetabulum joint itself compared to somebody in an anteverted position. So whether a person has a femoral neck or acetabular positioning relative to another person in a different alignment, that's going to dictate whether or not one gets wear and tear more prematurely than another. Somebody could also have a variation in anteversion or retroversion that changes the shape from front to back. So we could have somebody who is very anteverted on the very lowest part of their acetabulum and retroverted on the highest part, which means that if I'm doing a hip scour, which we'll talk about next, somebody in an anteverted, they have a nice smooth crease opening on the front. Retroverted, they might be a little bit limited, but the range of motion is back. Focal retroversion acts almost as an elliptical when you're doing a hip scour with that individual. The range of motion can be very different between the left hip and the right hip when it comes to degrees of anteversion as well. In females, you might have a range of between 5 degrees to 20 degrees of anteversion on one hip. You might have up to 20 degrees or more on the opposite hip. The difference between left and right can be as great as 20 degrees in itself. So you can have somebody like in the situation with the males, 0 degrees of anteversion up to 20 plus degrees of anteversion on the left side. So that variation in range of motion or the variation in geometry between left hip and right hip has a huge impact on the range of motion those hips can go through, and especially so when you look at asymmetry between left side and right side. Now, most people are going to sit in roughly the same degrees of anteversion one way or another, but you'll always have outliers that mean that you have to assess their program differently. If I have clients that can get to a certain range of motion, but other clients can't even dream of getting to that range, they may not do the exercise the same way, or they might have to adapt it one way or another. The major point of this, if I have somebody who's got femoral acetabular anteversion, meaning everything points forward, they're going to have a lot more hip flexion and a lot less hip extension range of motion. Less than 45 degrees of acetabular abduction, meaning out to the side, will create a greater amount of flexion. Greater than 45 degrees decreases the rotation and adduction available in that hip. Somewhere to get the greatest amount of mobility overall is between 45 to 55 degrees. Now, it's very tough to be able to see this without x-ray vision, so doing basic passive assessments is the best way that you can develop that kind of visual appearance as far as what that hip can do. If somebody also has a thicker femoral neck, they're going to have decreased range of motion in all directions. So this is something I like to call the cone of motion. If a person has a very shallow socket with a very thin femoral neck, they're going to have a massive range of motion available before bone-to-bone contact exists. If somebody has a really deep socket and a thick femoral neck, the range of motion they have before bone-to-bone contact happens is considerably smaller. Now, what was the point of going through all of that? Essentially to say everyone is different. We could have some people with giant ranges of motion based on their anatomy, based on their training, based on tissue tolerances, or we could have somebody who has next to no mobility. This means that not everyone will squat ass to grass, not everyone will press a weight over their head, and not everyone can join Cirque du Soleil. So if you try to force a range of motion on someone who can't achieve that range, bad things are probably going to happen. Injuries like FAI or impingement or anything like that is going to become a bad problem when you try to force a range of motion. If we do basic stuff like vary a foot position, width, depth, or even front to back alignment, or change an exercise to fit the individual, you can produce an optimum training program. Likewise, understanding the difference between passive mobility limitation based on structure and active mobility limitation based on motor control can dictate whether or not you put a person into a mobility development program or whether it's not worth their time to spend working on it. Lastly, we're going to talk about degenerative changes. Over time, people do lose range of motion. Their tissues change, their structure changes, and they wind up producing less available joint range of motion or tissue adaptations. So you could have two very different types of range of motion decreases in, say, the shoulder. The center of the glenoid fossa may bow out, and instead of having a disc shape, creates a flat shaped, which means now you're going to have a point of contact at a greater pressure than if you were to have that disc shape, that concave surface. You could also have a point where the outer edges of that glenoid fossa develop bone spurs and create a lipping effect, which means that now you have increased pressure in a different way. The shape of the acromion process plays a huge role in how shoulder health occurs or how shoulder range of motion occurs down the road, and has a huge impact in degenerative changes as well. A flat acromion or a curved acromion produces the greatest amount of subacromial space, whereas a hooked acromion has a considerably less range of motion available and less available space for the subacromial bursa or the supraspinatus to exist. If we have a really pronounced acromion process going out over top of that glenoid fossa and out over top of that humerus, it could also have a massive reduction in the range of motion to get that arm overhead. So the image on the left means that that person can get their arm overhead with minimal to no rotation of the scapula. The image on the right, that person's arm will not get higher than that bone, so they would have to tip their scapula into a much higher position in order to hope to get into an overhead position. The overall mobility of the individual can be determined based on basic tests like a Beighton hypermobility or Beighton laxity scale. If a person has a considerable amount of range of motion to them, maybe they were born with a higher amount of elastin compared to collagen. So if this is the case, we can go through a very basic 1 to 5 screening test.
Clap your hands now.